The chair of today's event is Dr. Janice Golden. Dr. Golden is a senior program manager at the United Nations Development Program in Tshwane. She was educated at the University of Cape Town and the University of Western Cape and holds a doctorate from Oxford University in England. Between 2012 and 2016, she served as a development practitioner at Switzerland's State Secretariat for Economic Affairs and previously as a South African public servant, overseeing capacity building development projects in the Southern African Development Community region. Dr. Golden is the author of 40 publications in peer-reviewed academic journals, scientific magazines, books, and book chapters on environment, development, and leadership in Africa. Dr. Golden, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation, which I was delighted to accept. But I must admit that I was somewhat daunted by the task of chairing this public dialogue. Given my background as a UN specialist on climate and environment, I was concerned that you might get the idea that this dialogue is about climate and how it might affect peace and security in Africa. But to allay your fears, this dialogue is strictly about South Africa's second year, chairing in its third term, serving on the UN Security Council. I want to say that it is important that we have multidisciplinary discussions in places of learning such as this. So I'm very comfortable to be here, and I want to encourage questions and rich debates to the speakers here today. But without further ado, let me welcome the students here this evening, the members of faculty at the University of Johannesburg, members of the academic, civil society, and business community, members of the public, government officials, and diplomats, with special acknowledgement to representatives of the following embassies that I see here this evening. I see Mexico, Indonesia, the UK, Switzerland, Japan, Senegal, Cuba, Israel, Germany, New Zealand, Norway. So we have a full house here this evening. In particular, I also want to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Esa Pahat, the former South African minister in the presidency, as well as Mr. Aziz Pahat, former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Poet Laureate Wale Serote. Thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. All protocols observed. In 2018, South Africa was elected as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council for the third term, to serve a 2-year term in 2019 and 2020. Tshwane, Pretoria, had served in this position for 2 previous terms during the Mbeki era in 2007 and 2008, and again in 2011 and 2012. With South Africa assuming the chair of the African Union, formally just a few days ago in fact, the opportunity to consolidate and fortify the joint efforts with the African Union, particularly its Peace and Security Council, represents unprecedented opportunity to advance in peace and security matters and to join African regional and sub-regional actors in joint efforts. In October 2019, South Africa chaired the UN Security Council, where it had principally 4 key priority areas: managing African conflicts, promoting cooperation between the United Nations and the African Union, pushing the agenda of women, peace and security, and promoting the AU campaign of silencing the guns by 2020. Chouani had organized a quarterly open debate on the Middle East, focusing on the Palestinian question. Under South Africa's presidency, the Council also considered various resolutions relating to mandate renewals, including on the joint border verification monitoring mechanism in Sudan and South Sudan, the UN mission for the referendum in Western Sahara, MINURSO, the AU-UN hybrid operation in Darfur, migrant smuggling in Libya, justice support in Haiti, and so on and so forth. During its presidency, Chouani further led the annual UN Security Council meeting with the AU Peace and Security Council in Addis Ababa, which discussed the cases of South Sudan, the Sahel, the Central African Republic, Libya, and Guinea-Bissau. South Africa believes that it is one of the potential holders of a permanent seat on the Security Council from Africa. And South Africa has often noted the double standards and the distortions that have arisen from the inequality and unrepresentativeness of many global institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF. So today, we are here to reflect and to discuss what may lie ahead for South Africa in its role serving on the UN Security Council. We are here to discuss some of the challenges and the matters that may require renewed emphasis. And leading us in the discussion are two eminent and distinguished speakers. So without further ado, let me commence with the introduction and start off by introducing our first speaker, Mr. Zahir Laher. He is the Chief Director in an acting capacity representing South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation, DIRCO, taking care of the portfolio on the United Nations, Peace and Security. A warm welcome, Zahir. Zahir has served in the Foreign Service for 22 years, including 8 years at the Permanent Mission of South Africa to the United Nations in New York. Mr. Laher holds a BA, an LLB, as well as an LLM from the University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg. And he also holds a certificate in conflict and dispute resolution from New York University. Our second speaker is the legendary Dr. David Malone. Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Malone. I am told that your flight arrived at 4:30. So fresh off the flight. Thank you very much for rushing through and not being stuck in the awful traffic of Joburg. I'm glad you made it in one piece. So Dr. Malone is the rector of the United Nations University in Tokyo. He holds the rank of Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. Dr. Malone was educated at the University of Montreal in Canada, the University of Cairo in Egypt, Harvard, and he holds a doctorate from my alma mater, Oxford University in England. He has served as Canada's envoy to India and as non-resident ambassador to Bhutan and Nepal between 2006 and 2008. And he has also served as a Canadian ambassador to the United Nations between 1992 and 1994. Dr. Malone is the author of many books, including Mega Regulation Contested, as well as the Oxford Handbook of United Nations Treaties. Thank you very, very much, dear panelists, for being with us here tonight. Each speaker this evening will deliver an address in succession to each other, each lasting no more than 20 minutes. Thereafter, we will take questions from the floor, perhaps 4 or 5 questions at a time, during the questions and answer segment of the dialogue. I want to point out that Chatham House rules do not apply. Many speakers here to say that things are off the record, but be informed that this will be captured on the screens and recorded. So without further ado, I call upon Mr. Laher to provide his delivery. Thank you very much, dear audience.
Program Director, fellow panelist David Malone, Professor Adebayo, and members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Department of International Relations and Coordination of the Republic of South Africa, I would like to thank the Institute for Pan-African Thought and for all of you for giving us this opportunity to engage with you today. I say the word engage because I think this is more of an engagement rather than me addressing you. We have served, as Janice has indicated, as South Africa we've served, is our third term serving on the Security Council. And one of the advantages we have for having served so quickly in succession or so soon after our previous terms was that we have some of the institutional memory on some of the things that we did well and some of the things that we did badly. And as we went into the Security Council for this term, we looked back at the reports that we had prepared previously. And one of the things that we realized was that we did not do adequate public engagement in South Africa. We were able to engage in New York and engage with the civil society organizations there, including the IPI and other organizations based in New York, and also with the media there. But in South Africa, often this engagement with the South African public about what were we doing in New York, why were we taking certain decisions was actually not there. So we've deliberately tried to improve that. And over the last year and a bit, the 13 months that we've served in this term, we've tried to improve that coordination and that engagement. We've been able to speak to students and members of the public in Johannesburg and Pretoria, but also in other parts of the country. We're not perfect as yet, but we're glad for this engagement. So we'd be glad to hear from you as well, and that's why I stress on the issue of engagement. So as indicated, as Janice indicated, we were elected on the 8th of June 2018 to serve for a 2-year term on the Security Council. So we began our term on the 1st of January last year, and at the end of this year, on the 31st of December of this year, we'll complete our term. We are serving as one of 10 elected members on the Security Council, and I stress elected rather than non-permanent. We are elected, and to my colleagues who are from the permanent membership of the Security Council, we deliberately say elected, because that in our mind gives us legitimacy. We have been elected by the members of the General Assembly to serve on the Security Council for a 2-year period with the mandate, and we serve in terms of the UN Charter as we believe we can make a contribution to international peace and security. The Charter does require that those that seek election to serve on the Security Council serve as they believe that they can make a contribution to international peace and security. We went into the Security Council with the theme continuing the legacy, working for peace and justice. That was the overall theme of our term. And the reason we chose this term was, one, we were elected during the year in which we commemorated the centenary of the birth of Madiba. So we wanted to utilize the values that he stood for in terms of that should be the underlying theme for what we would like to achieve on the council. But it was also about continuing some of the work that we started during our previous terms. One of the biggest constraints that elected members have is not the fact that we don't have the veto, but the fact that we only serve for 24 months. And those 24 months go by very quickly. So you may start initiatives and you're never able to complete them. As an elected member, you go in with constraints in that you've got to catch up very quickly, trying to get up to speed with the issues that are dealt with by the council. So you may start certain initiatives, you may want to do certain things in terms of how the contribution you'd like to make. And unfortunately, that before you know it, you're done with your term. So the advantage of having served quite recently, we were able to continue with some of the initiatives we began. And I'll touch on some of those issues as we look at our second year of our term. So when we went in, one of the key issues that we wanted to focus on was, needless to say, is to advocate for the peaceful resolution of conflict. We recognize the fact that in the conflict resolution spectrum, the United Nations Security Council has been fairly effective in some areas of resolving conflict, but has not been effective in resolving conflict across the board. What we find is that the UN, to a large extent, resolves conflict usually by, as a knee-jerk reaction, deploying peacekeepers to conflict situations and imposing sanctions and at rare occasions also authorizing the use of force. But where the Security Council has not been very effective is operating and taking action across the conflict resolution spectrum. So it's an analogy we've used before. It's akin to placing a plaster on a gashing wound. The Council often does not do enough to stop the wound from actually occurring or from taking place. And often, once a peacekeeping mission is perceived to have completed its work, the plaster is stripped off, and we then leave the wound as is, often not taking into account that wound may bleed again. So the Council does very little in terms of its post-conflict reconstruction and development aspects. So an area that we have tried to focus on during our term has been looking at conflicts more holistically, or looking at the resolution of conflicts more holistically, ensuring and emphasizing the importance of peaceful resolution of conflicts, mediation, political processes, which South Africa, by its nature, in terms of our own engagement in terms of our own experience of resolving our own conflict, is to emphasize the political resolution of conflicts. But also, as I indicated, the issue of post-conflict reconstruction and development is quite key. How do you then continue to engage as the international community in conflict situations once the hot conflict, once the actual guns stop firing, and you then withdraw the peacekeepers? What then do you do to ensure that you sustain your engagement in these conflict situations to ensure that the conflict does not break out again? And that often would require resolving the root causes of that conflict. So as we approach the Council, key issues that we sought to engage in has been one on ensuring the close coordination and cooperation between the African Union and the United Nations. This has been a core issue that we have focused on during our first two terms. During our first term, we piloted a resolution 1809, which focused on the financing, or started the debate rolling on the issue of financing AU missions that have been deployed to resolve conflict. So we go in with the philosophy that the core and the central responsibility for resolving international peace and security resides with the UN Security Council. However, regional organizations do have a key role to play in the resolution of conflicts. We have seen over the last few years particularly, but it's an issue that even the drafters of the Charter envisaged. In terms of those of you that are familiar with the UN Charter, Chapter 8 makes provision for regional arrangements. So we go in with the idea that while we recognize the fact that the Security Council bears the primary responsibility to resolve conflict or to ensure international peace and security, the regional organizations can and have been making a contribution. And the regional organization that is probably the most advanced in terms of having an established peace and security architecture is the African Union. The African Union has been, since the creation of the AU, has been quite effective in trying to resolve conflict on the continent, but it does have constraints. And trying to address those issues and trying to find partnership with the UN, which is tasked with global peace and security, has been a task that we have tried to take on. Additionally, we have tried to focus, and we have, and I'll point to examples where we have managed to succeed in driving the agenda forward, has been on the issue of women, peace and security. Women, peace and security is an issue that came to the Security Council in the year 2000, when Namibia, our neighbor, presided over the Security Council and piloted a resolution called Resolution 1325, which no doubt many of you that are practitioners and study international relations are familiar with. This resolution focuses on the particular impact that conflict has on women, and the effects of conflict on women, but also looks at ensuring and advocating for the role of women in the resolution of conflict. Over the last 20 years, and we're commemorating the 20th anniversary of this resolution, we have seen significant strides in the manner in which member states have tried to implement this particular resolution. But we've also seen significant gaps. Women continue to face the severe brunt of conflict, and when we study conflict situations, it's often the most vulnerable in societies that are impacted. But we also find that despite our efforts to try and ensure that women are playing a key role in the resolution of conflicts, we find that in most situations, when parties sit down to try and find or trying to resolve conflict, to try and sit down and sign peace agreements, women are omitted and left out of the room. Despite the fact that, and we've seen this in recent incidents, when civil society organizations take to the streets and demand social and political change, women are at the forefront. But thereafter, once the parties sit down to try and negotiate and find a resolution to the situation, they're then left out. So an area that we have tried to focus on is bringing attention to the implementation of Resolution 1325. And during our presidency of the Security Council, as Janice indicated, we presided over the council in October. We highlighted the importance of implementing Resolution 1325. Now, as we come to the end of our first year, midway through our term, and looking ahead at our second year, which is what I'm supposed to be speaking about, but I thought I'll start with a bit of a reflection on our first year. We find we are doing our own internal reflection on our term, and what we found is that we're serving in a council that is perhaps more divided than it has been in a long time. There's increasing geopolitical rivalries, particularly among the permanent members, and that has often led the council to be disabled and unable to deal with some significant peace and security matters that it should be dealing with. Even on issues where previously the council has been able to agree on, for example, on issues like humanitarian issues or humanitarian corridors, we now find that even on those issues, there's difficulty in getting agreement. We recently had an issue pertaining to a particular subject matter on the council where we were looking at the issue of opening or continuing the opening of humanitarian corridors to allow humanitarian access. And even on that issue, we found that there was disagreements, and political issues and political rivalries are creeping in on these issues. The way we've tried to sort, or the manner in which we've sought to try and make ourselves more effective and play a more relevant role within the Security Council is to ensure that we work closely with those members of the Council that are elected like ourselves, the elected 10 members of the Security Council, as well as the 3 African Council members. They're always, in the Security Council, there are always 3 African members serving on the Council. So we have sought to work very closely with what is called the A3, the 3 African countries, and the E10, the elected members of the Council, to ensure that we're able to bridge the gap, often when this gap arises between the permanent members. As South Africa, we have played a leading role in ensuring that elected members are able to work closer together. So what we did was we started an initiative together with Sweden in November 2018, where elected members were able to convene for the first time outside of New York to come together to discuss the challenges of serving as a Security Council member, as an elected Security Council member, but also to discuss opportunities in where we can play a meaningful role to try and move the agenda of the Security Council forward. That has now become an annual event. Well, we're hoping for it to become an annual event, but the second of that meeting took place in Brussels last November. With the other 2 African countries serving on the Security Council, last year it was Equatorial Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, and this year the A3 is Tunisia, Niger, and ourselves. We have tried to play a leading role on African issues on the Security Council. Unfortunately, many of the issues on the Security Council agenda are African issues. The nature of conflicts on the continent has resulted in many of these issues being discussed in the Security Council. As the A3, our key objective has been to ensure that the perspectives of the African Union and the regional economic communities are reflected in the work of the Security Council. And that has been to ensure that there aren't competing strategies and competing manners in which the international community reacts or tries to resolve conflict on the continent. We've seen in certain cases, we've seen it in Libya in 2011, and in other cases where regional organizations and the UN seems to be working at odds. So one of the key areas that we have tried to ensure is to ensure coherence as the A3, to ensure that the perspectives of the African Union, which is the regional body dealing with the conflicts on the continent, should be reflected in the UN. So to give you a practical example, late yesterday evening, South African time, in New York yesterday afternoon, the Security Council adopted a resolution on the situation in Libya. This was a resolution where, from our perspective as South Africa and as the A3, we tried to ensure that the resolution reflects the initiatives that the African Union, which is the body dealing with an African conflict that Libya is, that the African Union's perspectives and the decisions taken at the recent AU summit on the manner in which the AU would want to play a role in resolving that conflict is actually reflected in the UN decision. I thought let me try and reflect on those some of those key issues and some of the perspectives in which we've approached the Council. I think in some of the interactions we will have, we'll be able to get into some of the specific issues. But I want to just conclude by saying that in our second year of the Council, second year of our term, we envisage a year in which it's very difficult to prioritize what will be the issues you would want to follow. The Security Council's agenda is largely driven by what are the key global peace and security issues that emerge. But we can safely say that many issues on the Council's current agenda will surface again. We see on the African continent there are several country-specific situations that are moving from a conflict situation to a post-conflict phase. We see that in Darfur, we see that in the DRC, in other cases where there are elections taking place in the continent. These are cases where the Security Council and we would want to ensure that the UN continues to play some kind of role to address the post-conflict issues pertaining to those particular conflicts. We will preside over the Security Council for the second time. As you may know, Security Council members preside over the Council for a calendar month. We will preside over the Security Council in December. And this year presents an interesting opportunity for us because we're also wearing the hat of being the chair of the AU. As Janice has indicated, over the last few days, South Africa has assumed the chairship of the African Union. And that gives us an opportunity to ensure that the AU's perspectives are advanced, particularly in the context of this year being a year in which the African Union had agreed on or had put forward an aspiration to silence the guns on the continent by the year 2020. This is an aspiration that we will continue to work towards, both as African Union chair, but also serving on the premier international body dealing with global peace and security. So I'll leave it at that, Janice, and I think through the interaction we'll be able to engage on other matters.
Thank you for your eloquent articulation, excuse me, of South Africa's approach and position on the UN Security Council. For those of you who have burning questions, please remember them, jot them down, and you're welcome to ask those questions after Dr. Malone has delivered his address. Dr. Malone, please, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janice. Thank you very much, Zahir. And my apologies to all of you. The airline bringing me from Cape Town, normally a very reliable one, had a run of bad luck today. And so the flight ultimately was over 2 hours late. So I apologize for all of that. And I think it's remarkable that you have stayed throughout the long wait you've had. I'm very honored to be with South African colleagues here. One of them is with us, Aziz Pahad, who hosted me, I think, in South Africa a number of years ago. Now, how to not repeat what Zahir said so well, but rather perhaps say something different that complements what he said. I would say that it helps to think of the Security Council historically. So during its early years, from 1945 roughly, or at least 1948, let's say, until 1987, it was the period of the Cold War, where there were two very significant global powers who are often called the superpowers, the United States and the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, today the Russian Federation, minus some of those republics. And during that period, the Council perfected the art of making a difference in spite of very significant disagreements between Moscow and Washington at many different times. And each of those superpowers had a number of allies around them, so it meant that superficially, at least, there was a deadlock in international relations. But when one thinks of the Middle East, notably, actually the Security Council was able to reach a number of very significant decisions during those years, largely through the diplomatic skills of a number of other powers who kept cajoling the two superpowers into being a little bit more cooperative than they otherwise might have been. The Cold War ended in the Security Council rather surprisingly in 1987, 3 years before the Berlin Wall came down. And it ended because the recently re-elected Secretary General of the United Nations had actually challenged the Security Council to settle the Iran-Iraq war, which was a very murderous war of the time, which had taken or created hundreds of thousands of casualties, and which nobody else had been successful in influencing in any meaningful way, except selling a lot of weapons to one side in the conflict. The Security Council thought the Secretary General was being very provocative, and the permanent 5 members of the Council were a bit indisposed by this intervention, thinking the Secretary General was getting a bit big for his boots. But actually, as they had been meeting privately anyway for some months to agree on who should be elected or re-elected as Secretary General, one of the ambassadors involved said, well, why don't we have a private meeting or two away from the UN and as the permanent 5 and see if there would be a possibility of agreeing on a strategy. An excellent book has been written about all of this by an American diplomat called Cameron Hume, and for historians of the Council, it's well worth reading. He was later an ambassador of his country in Africa, I should add. So they met. What the Americans noticed, and the British and French, was that the Soviet position had evolved considerably, that they were quite open on what a settlement of the Iran-Iraq war might look like, which the Soviet Union had not been earlier under its rather fossilized leadership until Mikhail Gorbachev took over. And within 3 months, they had a concrete peace plan. The 5 countries agreed amongst them. It took them 2 more months to sell this plan to the elected members of the council. When the resolution was adopted, I think it was in June 1987, with the deployment of only very few observers on the Iran-Iraq border authorized, the war effectively came to a conclusion because the belligerents were pretty shocked by the Permanent Five being able to agree with each other on a strategy. And it was a strategy that wasn't seen as, in either country, as particularly unfair to them, which is usually the complaint of belligerent countries, that the Council isn't being fair to them. And that led on to the resolution of a number of other problems, one of them very close to South Africa, Namibia, and its stalled independence process, and several others. And it led to an era of near euphoria in the UN, that the Security Council could at last, rather than simply being active on the Middle East, it could make a real difference elsewhere in the world, notably the developing world, where so many lives were being lost because of conflict. And indeed, quite a lot was settled in, I'd say, the 5 years between 1987 and 1992. Alas, that period, which I know Dr. Adebajo studied quite a bit, ended or began to fall apart when the United States, adopting a very unyielding strategy on Iraq, after Iraq had been expelled from Kuwait with huge international support, there was virtually no opposition to that policy. But the United States wanted to adopt a very punitive attitude towards the defeated government of Iraq. And before too long, while the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation had gone along with the strategy, they defected. And then France defected from the strategy. And once that had happened, there was no longer council unity. And by and large, since then, after 5 years of being able to agree on pretty well everything, they have had great difficulty agreeing on anything. And that leaves aside the elected members, who of course have their own opinions and contribute those opinions and their national interests to the mix as well. And South Africa is a very meaningful elected member when it sits in the council. So a very short period of testing what was possible under the UN Charter, but because of American recklessness in pursuit of an objective that was widely agreed, nobody thought Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, was a Mother Teresa figure. Nevertheless, the Americans held very firmly to a position that was losing international support, hemorrhaging support internationally. So, that period has since, it took quite a long time before many of us who were principally observers of the UN realized that that period was actually over. It probably took me 8 or 9 years before I fully admitted to myself that that period was over. And the politics, the internal politics of various permanent members did not improve matters, because the flexibility the Russian Federation had been able to and willing to show under Presidents Gorbachev and Yeltsin went unrewarded largely by the Western community. They felt they had not been met halfway, and President Putin acted accordingly and fell out of a consensual relationship with the Western powers. And things have since gotten steadily worse in the Council. I think during your years, probably at some of their worst. Today, the truth is that while the focus of Council activity historically had been principally the Middle East, the Permanent Five cannot agree on anything significant in the Middle East anymore, except possibly the conflict in Yemen. And it's in Africa, as Zahir was mentioning, that the Council still, at times, is able to unite, but only when the African Union is united. When the membership of the African Union is disunited, either in fact or cosmetically disunited, then it becomes impossible, because the permanent members would sense that and then would defect from any possible consensus. So the African Union, where of course South Africa plays a very large role, is critical in my view in setting the African issues either on a path towards Security Council decisions, or if it's unable to reach internal agreement on a position, as was long time the case on Libya, for example. So congratulations that recently it has become possible to have resolutions on the subject on the basis of the AU position. It simply is impossible. Now, African countries, of course, have national positions. These national positions don't always correspond with the national position of the next country or a distant African country. And so African Union consensus requires a great deal of compromise by African governments. And it's good to be seeing that achieved much more than had been the case during the Cold War period. Again, the move from apartheid to a democratically elected government in South Africa was very helpful, because the voice of Mandela rang very loud, and some of his successors also. And so South Africa was able to play a bridge building role in Africa. It simply wasn't able to perform under apartheid. Indeed, it participated in no meaningful African forum latterly. Where are we today in the Security Council, leaving Africa and African issues aside? I'd say, sadly, in very poor shape indeed, because the Middle East has no credible regional organization, so any sense of possibility of agreement on Middle Eastern issues has evaporated. The Asian countries are very reluctant to bring any conflicts to the Security Council. They are, by and large, very averse to exhibiting their conflicts where they exist and resist. If you think of India and Pakistan, although Pakistan might have liked at times to have its own position prevail in the Security Council, that was unlikely ever to happen. And so, in many ways, Africa is more important to the Security Council today than the Security Council is important to Africa. And this is a tribute to African politicians of the 80s and 90s, and also practitioners, including a number of very strong South African practitioners, to realizing that through the African Union, through the economic communities, as Zahir mentioned, which at times have played a very important role, notably ECOWAS in West Africa, played a decisive role in Sierra Leone and Liberia, about which Professor Adebacho has written, in both cases, books. The truth is, today, it requires a great deal of consensus building, at which South Africa is very good, not just in the African context, but beyond, to get anything meaningful to happen in the Security Council, because there tends to be a ritualistic reiteration of earlier resolutions which disguises the lack of novelty very often. One exception being the Women, Peace and Security resolution, which actually was new and actually has no trouble finding consensus in the Security Council. I'm going to stop there. You've all been tremendously patient. I wanted to give you just a personal view on this. I did have a shirt and tie in my bag, but there was no time to put it on, so Zahir, no disrespect to you, or Janice, who's so elegant. This is just the way I travel, and I apologize for it. So thank you all very much, and I'll go and sit down now.
So I want to some information about the role of South Africa in implementation of the decision of 2334 of the Security Council, which belongs to the Israeli settlement in West Bank. And other question about what happening nowadays in the UN after the Trump decision of sincerity. So also we noted that Minister Naledi addressed the Security Council last year, and she suggested some ideas and or demands, actually demands to implement the decision of the Security Council number 2334. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Disa. My question is, if we can all agree that a lot of the issues on the UN Security Council pertain to the continent of Africa, how can it be the case that an African country isn't on the permanent Security Council? And what do we need to do to ensure that we leverage African diplomatic power to ensure that happens?
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. My name is Frank Asimo. I'm the chairperson of the Congolese Diaspora for Nelson Mandela Legacy. I really appreciate the theoretical job you've been doing on the ground. But if you ask me to take you seriously, I think First of all, what are the coercive powers that the United Nations Security Council ought on America, the United States of America? And to take also you seriously, I think you must complete your job in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. What is going on there? After 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line, but nothing. You say, no, the role of South Africa is to manage the problem, the conflict in Africa. It's fine. But what is happening there in Congo? What about the election? What is this? Even what America is doing there, Trump can come and say, okay, no, between Israel and Palestine, I put the waterproof plane, so whether or not you like it or not, not like that. Please, not like that. Do something. So that you are not playing a supernumerary role. Please, to all Africa.
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you. My question is really to Mrs. Zahir. A few days ago, it seemed South Africa refused to sponsor the UN Security Council proposal from, I think it was put forward by Indonesia and Tunisia on the Trump peace plan. It was very surprising that, it seemed the folks at the UN Security Council refused to sort of sponsor this resolution, whereas Ramaphosa, on the one hand, he was really very strong on this issue, calling it really what it is, basically a Bantustan plan. Naledi Pandor previously has been very strong on this issue as well. So it seems there's sort of a very, different policies that's happening between the multilateral desk and the politicians. Can you just very clarify what has sort of been the relationship and the communication since South Africa has taken the seat at the Security Council? Thank you.
No, thank you. I think this is why these kind of forums are useful, because it helps to clarify some of the misconceptions that's out there. Let me start with the question raised by our colleague, the lady out there, and our colleague from Palestine is somewhat linked. So let me just touch on that. Firstly, the position on Resolution 2334, just to inform colleagues what that is about. Resolution 2334 was adopted in December 2016. It's the last resolution that the Security Council was able to successfully adopt on the situation in Palestine. You would know that there are certain issues with the Security Council where the Security Council has been stuck. I think David mentioned the difficulties the Council has had because of the nature of the geopolitical dynamic, the issue of the permanent fire veto, etc. And the Council has not been able to move on certain issues. This resolution was adopted, and it basically indicated that Israeli settlement activity was a flagrant violation of international law, and it called on Israel to stop that activity. South Africa was not serving on the Council at the time, but we fully support Resolution 2334. In all our statements pertaining to settlement activity, we make reference to Resolution 2334 as a resolution that should be abide by, the member states should abide by the resolution, and it should be implemented. This is vital for the Council to retain its credibility, for the international rule of law to be respected. It is important that member states abide and respect resolutions. With regard to recent events in the Middle East and the resolution that you mentioned, the Security Council met this last Tuesday. There was a debate in the Council that was requested, and the Council was, you may have seen it, the Council was addressed by the President of the State of Palestine, President Mahmoud Abbas, who presented the views of his government on the recent events, on the plan that was put forward by President Trump. There was no resolution tabled. There is discussion on the possibility of a resolution, and South Africa will then determine its perspective on the resolution, should the resolution be tabled. For now, there's no resolution that has been tabled. There's been talk of a resolution that you have perhaps seen in the media. But I think what you do rightly point out is the statements made by President Ramaphosa and Minister Pandor, as well as the statement delivered by our representatives at the UN, which reflects the same perspective, which is an indication that for South Africa's perspective, and it's a perspective held by the majority of council members that spoke at the debate on Tuesday, which is that the parameters of the settlement on the Israeli-Palestinian matter the international legal parameters have already been agreed upon and they should be respected. And that is basically based on resolutions that have been adopted previously by the United Nations, including Resolution 242, 338, 2334 as well, in terms of the issue of the definition of what a Palestinian state should look like. So we reaffirm those international legal parameters, which, from our perspective, reflects the international law and reflects the basis in which any settlement should be based upon. With regard to the question on Africa's seat on the Security Council, I think that's a very important question to know. Firstly, I should say that Africa does have permanent presence on the Security Council. In fact, Africa has 3 seats on the Security Council at all times. Out of the 15 seats on the Security Council, 3 are always occupied by African countries. But where Africa does not have presence is in the permanent category of the Security Council. In the permanent category are basically 5 countries that are there all the time. They do not have to go through the process of being elected by the General Assembly. They also have the right of what has been termed the right of veto, which implies that they have the ability to vote against any resolution that is tabled and prohibit that resolution from being adopted. So Africa does not have a presence in the permanent category, but Africa does indeed have 3 seats at all times in the Security Council. From the African Union's perspective, this is unfair in terms of not having a permanent or a seat in the permanent category. The African Union member states met in the Zurich in Swaziland and adopted a common African position, which reflects on this particular position and reflects on the unfairness of Africa as a continent in which many of the conflicts, unfortunately, that are on the agenda of the Security Council, unfortunately, African conflicts. It's not something we should be proud of, it's something we should try and lessen. And actually, in the recent years, the agenda of the Council, which perhaps at some stage was about 70% of African issues, has come down somewhat. But perhaps it's more the fact that conflicts have broken up in other parts of the world rather than the African conflicts diminishing. But I think in some parts of the continent we have seen progress. As an aside, I think in West Africa, what we saw a few years ago with Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire, those conflicts have subsided. So we have a position on reform. We advocate for that position on reform. In fact, this week, I think today, the debate will continue in the General Assembly. There's an intergovernmental process in which member states are negotiating reform of the Security Council. And South Africa and other member states will participate in that debate, where we will advocate for Africa to be included in the permanent category of that of the Security Council. I think I'll leave that one there. There was a comment on the DRC. I think there wasn't a question there, but just to indicate that from our perspective, we will continue to ensure that there is focus on conflict situations on the continent. We support political processes that are underway, but together with international support, including UN support for these processes.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to, Zahir, having spoken very well on the subjects he addressed, the one I'll come back to in terms, again, of a historical analysis would be Security Council reform. Because several times, actually, South Africa did play a role on this question. So, Security Council, the Security Council's composition was reformed once during the era of decolonization, simply to create 4 new elected seats that would somewhat rebalance the council, but there was no agreement at all, least of all by the Permanent Five, to create new permanent seats there. This was in the early 1960s. Now, during the period I mentioned when there was much more agreement in the international community than there is today after the Cold War had run its course, that raised the question of, well, now that the Permanent Five seem to be able to agree on things together, might they perhaps agree to Security Council reform? And 4 countries of the developing world worked together very closely. South Africa worked with those 4 for a while, but then decided its interests in African unity were stronger than its national interests and withdrew from the group. So let me be specific. Who were these countries? 2 were developing countries and 2 were not. But it was driven in very large part by the 2 developing countries, which were Brazil and India. The other 2 were Japan and Germany. So these countries together lobbied very hard, very effectively. They threw everything they had in terms of diplomatic influence, and each of them has considerable diplomatic influence into convincing the rest of the members that they should agree to a formula which was never 100% agreed amongst them, but largely agreed amongst them, that the council would create permanent seats for themselves. Whether those permanent seats would have vetoes attached to them or not was left a little bit vague. Some of them felt stronger about having a veto than others. But a problem arose rather late in the process, perhaps because South Africa had withdrawn from being a contestant, so to speak, because in the non-African world, there would have been no opposition to South Africa becoming a permanent member, had it not been for the Permanent Five. So there was a huge diplomatic campaign on in 1994 and 1995 to secure those 4 permanent seats, and what those countries left open on Africa was how many elected seats, additional elected seats, or permanent seats Africa might get. However, that opened a huge breach in what could have been a united position. So actually South Africa did play a significant role at the time, which isn't so well remembered in South Africa anymore. So I'm sure Zahir remembers it very well. So what happened, in effect, was far from there being African unity on anything, there was African disunity over who the permanent member candidates might be, because Africa is no longer a continent of one sub-regional power or two. It's a continent of a number of very meaningful powers, with Egypt and Ethiopia now joining the powers that were most often mentioned at the time. And that dispersion of power throughout Africa actually probably will serve, at least for a while longer, as a disincentive to anybody else to try to have the Security Council reformed. I'm not blaming South Africa in any way. Actually, I admire it for being self-denying in the interests of African unity. I just wanted to be clear about the facts, because enjoying academic freedom, I can be a bit undiplomatic on academic grounds. So that's my interpretation of those events. The most important fact in all of this is each of the permanent five were thoroughly hypocritical. Each of them. I say this equally about all of them, because they all went around assuring various interested countries, oh, we really support you, we think you're so important, we think it's all such a good idea, but actually behind the backs of the four principal claimants, they went around busily torpedoing any possibility of a majority of votes being in favor of the idea of the four being accepted, with something vague on Africa also being accepted. So there I'd say the permanent five were equally hypocritical in their public posturing on this particular issue. And I think the other questions have been answered very well. This one was also answered well by Zahir, and my only intention is to complement what he said.
The first one is, who controls the United Nations? Is it the president, the richest people in this world, or the Queen of England? Why is everyone not avoiding the truth? America is a terrorist state. They killed Soleimani, Muammar Gaddafi, but the United Nations is saying nothing. Is Africa involved and other Asian countries in this security of the United Nations? Thank you very much.
I'd like to pose the question of South Africa's. This time around, South Africa seems to have been quieter than the last 2 terms. One of the things I do at an individual level from my academic work is to look at the perceptions through the media. And if you look at media coverage of South Africa's presence this time around, it has been far less prominent than the last 2 occasions. Might it be that South Africa is very scared of the blunders it made in the previous occasions? So much so that including Libya, including Myanmar, and issues like that. Is South Africa therefore kind of recoiling from taking some very firm positions as it did last time? Might it also be that this time around, unlike in the past, particularly the first term, South Africa's philosophical underpinnings are shaky ground? Initially we had African Renaissance and Mbeki. This time around we seem to be more transactional, but without anything firmly foundational to it. Might this explain therefore why we are not hearing so much of South Africa, at least in the media, at least even if you did content analysis? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. As they were giving a good presentation. Thank you, guys. I read something very interesting because I asked myself, who funds the UN? And what I read, and I don't trust everything I read, so I want clarification from you guys. It says that the UN has 193 members, and together they all contribute. All right, okay. So I further read something that amused me, and I want to know if this is true. It said that 22% is actually funded by the United States. If the permanent five are the largest contributors of the UN, how does that affect them making decisions for the United Nations? I mean, I could imagine, if I'm funding something more than anyone, no one else can have a say in the company or whatever. So, as you mentioned, Zaire, that most of the problems in the UN is African problems. If the United States is funding more of the UN, why? What is so special about Africa? Are they protecting their investments? Maybe they've invested a lot in this country because of the World Bank, maybe perhaps. Even China, China's been investing a lot in bridges and infrastructure in Africa. So I just want to know, does that have an influence to the decision making in the UN? Thank you.
Evening, my name is Larato. Quick one. My question is, are we asking the right questions at the UN? The reason why I'm saying this is that recently we've seen Omar al-Bashir be taken to the ICC, not by us, by the UN. And you get to ask yourself, what is the African Union doing? Because where I'm saying, the African Union should be the one that is taking Omar al-Bashir to the ICC. The African Union should be the one that is questioning a lot of inhuman things that are happening in Africa. And the question is, are you guys asking the right questions on our behalf? Because where I'm saying, you guys are not asking the right questions. Like he said, in DRC, you go to Lubumbashi, you get there, you see that the people in Lubumbashi are buying things from Lusaka because that's the nearest place where they can get food. So you need to go back and ask yourself, what is it that you're asking on our behalf so that we can have an African Union that is working on our behalf. And when they get to the UN, they also ask the right questions for our security as women and children of this continent.
Thank you very much. David will take the funding question, the issue of the budget, and thank you for that very good question in terms of the manner in which member states contribute to the UN. With regard to the question about our role in the Security Council and whether we're getting media coverage, you could perhaps say that perhaps we're doing something right, and that's why we're not in the media. It depends how you interpret it. But we'd like to believe that from our perspective, we are continuing with the foreign policy that is predictable and value-based, based on our constitution. The decisions and positions we've adopted in our first 2 terms without going into them were based on the same principles. We are continuing those issues. We are continuing to base our decisions on the values in our constitution. We've had some very difficult issues during our current term, including on the situation in Venezuela, the situation in Syria, the situation in Palestine. There are many issues that we deal with on a daily basis. We continue to take what we like to believe principled, independent positions. There was an interesting review by civil society organizations sometime last year, and what they found, and just and this is I'm quoting the civil society review on our term thus far. They indicated that South Africa is indicating and illustrating a very independent perspective on the Security Council, and is not seen to be on any side in terms of the polarization of the Security Council. And this is something we strive to do, that the decisions we take, the positions we adopt on a daily basis is based on our own principles and our own values, and that of the continent in terms of how we intend to resolve these conflicts, or how we want to contribute to the resolution of these conflicts. With regard to some of the others, I think there were more comments. I won't comment too much on the budget one, as David will go into that. But with regard, I just want to conclude with the point that the UN, when we look at the United Nations, it's not an entity that is out there that is based on or located on the East River in Manhattan. But what it is, it's a body that we all part of. We are all part of the United Nations. When the UN fails to do certain things, it is us as member states that fail. The UN decisions are made by member states, and yes, within the UN, and within the decision-making processes, there are certain impediments, perhaps, that do not allow for certain decisions to be made. But at the end of the day, we are all, as member states, part of the United Nations. And as a member state that takes its obligations and its membership very seriously, we commit to work within that framework to try and make a difference. We also are cognizant of the fact that there are deficiencies in the organization, and that is part of the discussions that are going on with regard to reforming, to make it more effective, making it more credible, to ensure that all member states, particularly those that were left out at the time of the creation of the organization, are included in the decision-making of the organization.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to end in part by saying something I'd intended to say at the outset. 20 years ago, Professor Adebacho and I were working together in New York in the International Peace Institute. And during the years we worked together, which was about 4 years, there were some very, very influential African diplomatic leaders at the UN, one of whom was South African, and I'd like to pay tribute to him because he died recently, and that is Dumisani Khumalo. He was a towering figure in the UN who actually came to be somewhat disabused by the end of his years at the UN because he was a tremendously successful bridge builder. He generally believed the best about all of his interlocutors. He was a very generous man, and who by the end of his period felt that actually the many favors he had done so many other countries had not been returned in equal measure, particularly by the Permanent Five. So he came away from his long experience as an extremely influential ambassador at the UN, somewhat, I don't think Dumi could have been bitter, but I think his view of the world changed towards a more hard realist view than he had going into the experience. He was somebody I hugely admired. I think Adi admired him a lot too. There were some other African giants at the time in New York, and it was an exciting time. Now, coming to your question about money, and you're so right to ask about money because it winds up somehow always being important. So, money has, I'd say, for the last 30 or 40 years consistently been a problem at the UN because some countries pay late, nearly on principle. I could name a few, but I won't. And they include industrialized and developing countries. It isn't a developing country versus an industrialized country problem at all. It's much more a question of national priorities of the countries involved. But to come to your question, having said that money's been a problem a long time at the UN, that the scale of assessments, what you wind up paying as a country, is calculated along a complex formula in which developing countries get a discount, but not as heavy a discount as many of them could argue they deserve, given their level of financial stress at home. The industrialized countries pay a bit more. On peacekeeping, the permanent five pay a little bit more while they have all the power. They pay only a little bit more than other countries proportionately. All of this is contentious, but the biggest problem, and it's increasingly a corrosive problem again, after 10 reasonably good years, I'd say, from the early 2000s until quite recently, the principal problem today is countries paying late. Some because they genuinely are in a crisis situation. Those countries, if they can convince the rest of the countries, often get an exemption for some time from their dues, but they have to have a good case. So I think about 10 countries are currently exempted from losing their vote in the UN. They could still be present, some countries having lost their vote in the General Assembly are. They still sit in the General Assembly, but they don't have a vote. Other countries who cannot make a sufficiently strong case are now in serious arrears and have lost their votes. Is it about 10 now? I forget. Yeah. Which nobody likes to see, because everybody would like to see all countries pay, share the burden, and so on. But you're right to ask about money. Money is at the root of a great deal of trouble, nationally, internationally, in all countries, and internationally nearly all the time. And so it's always important in institutions, and in the UN it is no less important than in other institutions. And I'll stop there, again thanking you all for your patience, and thanking Zahir for having given, I thought, a wonderful expose on what South Africa sees as its priorities at the moment. I heard nothing I disagreed with, and that's 100% the truth.
Thank you very much. My concluding remarks are brief and short, like me. But I would like to say that what I found striking about the range of questions here this evening was the fact that, it was raised almost every time, the perpetual challenge of matters, the resolutions and votes that get stuck in the Security Council. And that often to get these matters unstuck requires hard lobbying and excellence in diplomacy. And I think, of course, leveraging the strength and the consensus within the African Union. I certainly also think that the formation of the African free trade, the African continental free trade area, where the South African Welile Mene assumed the post of Secretary General, perhaps also offers unprecedented opportunity to give practical effect to development and to resolving some of the challenges involving peace and security issues on the continent. But for the by and large, I think from here on the Institute will go from here, I suppose put out a news article and work on a policy brief in collaboration with the Ministries of Defense and Foreign Affairs that summarizes some of the the main findings and formulates it into policy recommendations. I think Professor Adebayo can say more on that. So I want to thank our marvelous speakers for their deliveries. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Zahir. I also want to thank the audience, the listeners, as well as those who've raised some very important questions, and to thank them for the rich discussions. The library, who provided the space and the food, and of course also to Ade and his team for organizing a really wonderful event. Thank you very much.